A woman was hosting a dinner party, and she asked her daughter, who was at the table, to say grace. The little girl said she didn't know what to say. The mother told her, "Say what you hear Mommy say." So the girl nodded, bowed her head, and said this, "Dear Lord, why in the world did I invite all of these people to dinner?" I think we can identify with that mother, for today we live at a frenetic pace in our lives, in an age that some have called an activity addiction, full of pressures, full of demands. And some of the issues and difficulties of our lives these days are so overwhelming. And so like the little girl, we might raise our hands and say, "Dear Lord, why do I have all of this on my shoulders right now? What am I to do?" Well, we can imagine that Jesus and his disciples felt the same kind of pressure. For wherever Jesus went, the crowds pressed in, demanding his attention. Today we take a break from our reading of the Gospel of St. Mark for a reading in this great chapter 6 of St. John's Gospel. And we will continue for the next several weeks with our Sunday Gospel from this remarkable chapter. Our reading today describes the familiar story of the multiplication of the 5 loaves and 2 fish as Jesus fed the 5,000 men. Now, there must have been some gender bias in this account. For if we count the wives and all the children of the men present, we may have had a crowd of about 20,000. Now, in my younger days, math was not my cup of tea, especially math word problems. So let's look at this. We got 5 loaves and 2 fish and 20,000 people. Well, my math doesn't add up. And the gospel doesn't give us any idea how it happened either. Did the food just reconstitute itself as it got passed around? Did it somehow stretch as each person tore off their chunk? Was the food placed in the baskets suddenly filled to the brim? Well, we don't know. What we do know is that Jesus performed a miracle. And this is a very significant miracle because it's the only one recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. But it's not significant simply for the feeding of thousands of hungry bellies. John calls it a sign because it's full of hidden meanings. Jesus uses it to draw attention to that most basic instinct in us, food. Jesus knew they would be distracted if they were hungry. St. Francis once said, "You can't preach the gospel to empty stomachs." And I venture there's a few of us out here right now thinking about what we're going to eat after Mass today. Jesus desired the people in their hunger to experience need, to experience dependence, so that they might see that their spiritual hunger is even more fundamental. So in the scarcity of food, Jesus shows himself to be the only one who can satisfy our deepest hungers, our deepest thirsts. Jesus is the only one to help us in what seems like impossible situations, and then provide it in abundance so that all are satisfied. To better understand the story within a story of this gospel reading, let's see where each one of us would place ourselves in today's reading. So who does Jesus see first? The crowd. Well, Jesus knew the crowd's motives in pursuing him, and they weren't for his sake or for his teaching. They were probably rather superficial and selfish. Can we see ourselves in the crowd, just kind of floating along, hidden in the middle? Do we risk standing out, or do we risk being seen by him? And with the crowd, the disciples must have been thinking, what in the world are we going to do with all of these people? Well, Philip, who was the local boy in the group of disciples, is asked where we can buy food for the crowd. Philip immediately starts to calculate, but he did so without considering who Jesus is. And so he complains in very businesslike fashion. 200 days' wages are not going to be enough. Well, obviously, Philip has no solution. Many times in our lives, we think that our problems are just too big for us to handle. And you know what? We're right. But the problem is that sometimes we handle them the wrong way. Like the disciples, we easily focus on the impossibility of the task, and thus we give in to worry and anxiety or fear or defeat. I must confess that I fall into this trap repeatedly, constantly. You know, researchers have told us that men tend to overestimate their abilities and underestimate the dangers. Women, on the other hand, are just the opposite. They underestimate their abilities and overestimate the dangers. Yes, we're complementary, and yes, we can learn from one another, but the lesson today is that we should be learning from Jesus and relying on him. Are we like Philip, faced with crowds and asked the impossible? Who do we place our trust in? Andrew, instead of complaining, seeks a solution. He brings a small boy to Jesus who has 5 barley loaves, 2 fish, which is basically the daily ration of the poor in those days. And barley was the bread of the poor. And although Andrew despairs that it's not enough, he seems to think this is the place we can start with. Are we like Andrew, bringing people to Jesus for the solution of our problems? Or are we like the little boy, giving what little we have to offer, knowing that God can make much of what we have to offer? Have we not experienced a time in our lives when there just wasn't enough of something, whether it be time or money or strength or courage or love? Fill in the blank here. And yet our faith in God got us through. You see, in the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, Jesus takes whatever we have to offer, he blesses it, and it becomes enough to feed the multitude with plenty to spare. Pope Benedict put it this way: the miracle was not worked from nothing, but from a modest sharing of what a simple lad brought to him. Jesus does not ask us for what we do not have. I think that bears repeating. Jesus does not ask us for what we do not have. Put another way, he uses inadequate people like us to surrender what they have to him to meet the overwhelming needs of others. When Jesus multiplies the loaves and the fishes, St. John wants us to see that this is a sign pointing to Jesus, who not only gives us bread, he is the bread of life, which is the entire focus of this chapter 6. Jesus is the only food that can satisfy the very deepest of our hungers. When we feel inadequate, when our resources and resolve do not measure up to the demands and expectations that are placed on us, we need to reject the false promises of this world, and instead of looking to the material for our salvation, we need to see that Jesus is the food that ultimately sustains and saves us. We need to see that Jesus in the Eucharist is the food that we are starving for. Now, brothers and sisters, we can see that the feeding of the crowd was more than just a dinner miracle to impress. Jesus is giving all of us an invitation to a life of multiplication today. If we take what we have and trust it to Him, He will make use of it beyond our greatest expectations.